DeSmauging, time discounting, what every environmentalist needs to know about yet another economics fraud. During this presentation, since most of the information is in writing, I'm going to be pretty quiet and just let you read the slides. So, integrated assessment models, or IAMs, are used by, quote, economists, end quote, to determine what the cost of a unit of carbon will be to the gross domestic product of the global economy. Or it doesn't have to be the global economy; it could be others as well. And I suppose they could be used for other things besides carbon release, like methane release or all greenhouse gas release. The classic one by William Nordhaus, or ones simply involve carbon. Um, I am kind of using integrated assessment models interchangeably with any environmental damage function. So it could be the cost to the environment of a house in terms of the landscape and animal habitat it destroys. It could be the pollution that a factory creates in a lake, the cost in human health that it causes. It could be deforestation and the cost of society that entails. All of these costs are not captured in the market. So while the market may capture the relative desire of people to consume something and the labor, profits, and rents that go into producing it, it may not capture things like future damage to gross domestic product and otherwise from the climate changing. It may not capture, uh, the habitat loss from a new house, things like that. Those are called negative externalities. So what economists essentially do is figure out how much those negative externalities are, and then take that cost and put it in terms of a tax as part of the price of doing any of those activities, which, other things being equal, generally means that there'll be less of those activities done. The reason I'm calling this another economics deception is because there are many cases in economics where false ideas are being put forth that dictate what policy should be done, and those ideas involve sort of a pseudo reasoning. So policymakers are led to believe that there'll be a certain result that will not, in fact, be the case. And although I'm not going to talk about this very much today, I was amazed. It's probably the worst fraud ever committed in the history of humanity. At least it's up there with Pol Pot and Stalin and Mao, in terms of what William Nordhaus, who designed integrated assessment models, did in particular. And it's in the reference. There's a Science magazine article by him. It was written not long after the Stern report, which kind of really scared the world about the dangers of climate change. He was the first economist really writing on that. And in his response, the number of lies and falsehood that Nordhaus conveyed and told in, telling us that Stern was exaggerating the dangers was almost unbelievable. I think 90% of the article was basically a lie. And he made it sound as if it was really sound, hard, core economic reasoning, when in fact it was just a bunch of false statements. So not only did he commit this fraud, he was probably successful beyond his wildest imaginations. People who were really scared by global climate change stopped being. And these are scientists and people who are very well educated and should know better. I'll grant Nordhaus this. He was telling people what they wanted to hear, and every great fraud involves telling people what they want to hear. You don't get successful telling people what they don't want to hear, unfortunately. Like, we have to make major societal changes in response to the threat presented by anthropogenic global climate change. So it's really, really disturbing. Government, the population. I mean, I'll read articles today about time discounting where the authors are still buying into the kind of lies that Nordhaus told. Most of these involve the interest rate and the rate of return. He has this idea that time discounting, which basically does about one thing, it makes other generations less important than us, is somehow a function of the interest rate and market forces and the return on capital. That's a good one. The return on capital has absolutely zero to do with the rate of time discounting. The return on capital is how much you get back when you grow a tree, start a factory, put some money in. A little bit later, you get more back. That's return on capital. Time preferences are how much an individual prefers something now as opposed to getting it later. They have nothing to do with each other. And Nordhaus implied that they were the same thing, so that putting this time discount on the IAMs would sound like it's some sort of hardcore economic reasoning. He also used the word efficient repeatedly. Time discounting is inefficient. Almost all economists agree that it has nothing to do with efficiency. It has nothing to do with hardcore economic. It's simply an opinion. Okay, and in almost all cases, if a model, basically in all cases, if a model is otherwise constructed correctly and parameterized rightly, putting a time preference on it will lead to inefficient outcomes. So, get what I'm saying? A time preference is unethical because it puts our generation's needs and before others. It's also inefficient. And Nordhaus acted like it was efficient, and then he goes so far as to act like it's somehow ethical as well. Okay, this may be a little hard to grasp. I'm just gonna move on, and we'll see where we're at. Okay, so Eugene von Beauvoir came up with this idea, and it arguably been around for a while, but he was the one that really put out the idea that people prefer something now to tomorrow, and this is why you're willing to pay interest. You're willing to pay interest on money you borrow because it's not worth as much to you today as tomorrow. And that is what it is. He also, as I noted, used that to very effectively, although he was wrong, sort of disprove Marx's theory of exploitation, which is stupid anyhow. But I mean, exploitation exists, but Marx does a terrible job of trying to explain it. So basically, it's one thing to say people have time preferences. Okay. It's another thing to say that because I prefer something more than I do another person, that is somehow a time preference. I mean, come on. According to the kind of basic rules of neoclassical economics, everybody prefers everything 100% more to anybody else. Okay, unless there's some kind of empathy going on, which can be rolled into it. But basically, trying to put a time preference to future generations is insanity, and most economists also agree that you can't do that. But this mistake continues to be made. So through this absurd use of time preferencing, What Nordhaus is arriving at is a conclusion is that essentially your grandchildren matter less than 1/300th as much as you do and we do. Okay, so if we create $3 of damage now, excuse me, if we create $1,000 of damage tomorrow, we only need to pay back society $3 for one reason, because it's in the future. That's what he's saying. So basically, if there's $1,000 of damage that we do now, it only costs $3, and there's really nothing to worry about. And that's key to how, well, the way he did it was using a lot of lies, but that's key to what he convinced the world of. So for one, that's all you really need to read right now. Basically, what most non-economists don't understand when they think time discounting is crazy is that GDP has been growing almost continuously for 200 or 300 years now. So economists think it's just going to keep growing forever. So everyone else is going to be a lot richer than we are. So of course we're going to count them as less because they have a lot more. They have a lot more money. We can take more from them now. We can destroy more of the earth now, take more GDP away from them now, because they're going to have much more later, and we're basically giving it to them by all the science and technology we're developing. Okay, I'll let you read number 2 now. This argument was presented by a philosopher, actually, not an economist, one of the rare philosophers who's in favor of a positive time preference discount. Basically, of all people through all space and time, we're supposed to care for them all equally. I mean, what would that mean exactly? We should basically give everything we own, but we can barely need to subsist to everybody else. I mean, why aren't we sending, all of our worldly possessions to Africa and living in a shack? So yeah, it's absurd to think of the future and other people and rate them the same as we do ourselves, our family, and our friends and our country. Okay, so if you just read number 3, please. Okay, basically, savings is a little bit different in economics than you and I think of it, but we can actually understand this through how most people understand savings. It's pretty simple. You come all surprised and thought, or maybe you have. I may have too and forgotten. So I encounter this, but if you wanted to make as much money as possible in a lifetime, assuming that you could get no different salary, you could not get a higher salary. It's just pretend you can't. Okay, um, you know what you would do is only spend what you need to survive and put everything else in a savings account. If you did that, then the day you died, you'd be richer than if you failed to save any amount of that. Okay, so that's a simplified way of explaining the indefinitely postponed splurge. Like basically, if economists want to maximize welfare, which they do, then their argument would be that no one should ever consume and just save everything. So that doesn't make any sense. And the only way you can make sense out of it is to include a time preference. If you include a time preference, you include a time discount, which comes from a time preference. I tend to kind of slip and call a time discount a time preference. They're actually different, but in Bomba-Works construction, because people have a time preference, they discount things for time. But anyhow, if you have a time discount in there, then it makes sense for you to spend some and save some and not just spend or save everything. How much is that discount? Nobody knows. Koopmans didn't know. That's one of the reasons it's such a bizarre thing for economists to talk about, especially acting as if it has some sort of positive or ultimate right value. And Okay, this one's pretty straightforward. It's not very important. The reason it's not very important is no one really argues about this very much. This value is usually quite small. Nordhaus, who had a very low discount rate that caused this huge controversy where Nordhaus told a lot of lies, he actually included one, and no one really debated it because it was so small. Okay, so this one's basically saying, well, how much do people really leave to their kids? Das Gupta in a paper, I think is called the Review of the Stern Review, said like 15%. A lot of that's also left behind accidentally. It's a little more complicated than economists usually make it. I'm not going to go there right now. But basically, people don't leave very much to their kids. They spend a lot of what they have. So we're not treating future generations the same as we are ourselves. So why should we do that when we're talking about environmental damage functions? Okay, so let's see. Cost and benefit analyses require a discount rate. So anyhow, yeah, right. When we save money, we're earning an interest rate. So, we're time discounting and we do that. The bank is too. You're giving them money now, which they prefer, so they got to pay you more later to make up for it. So, yeah, we all do that on the markets. Of course, we should time discount integrated assessment models, right? Okay, so what do you think? Okay. So now I'm going to tell you why everything I just told you is justification in environmental damage compensation is just basically all false. Okay, one. So we have this idea that GDP is always growing. They're going to have people are going to have more later. We all know from economics that the more you have, the less it's worth generally. Although Nordhaus does not actually include that in his model, anyhow. But that has nothing to do with time. So go ahead and I'll let you read this. So sort of a little footnote from this is that basically, if we're so worried about smoothing all consumption across time, why aren't we worried about doing it across space? It would. There's no difference. I mean, these economists do not spend a lot of time telling us that we need to be taking all of our income and dividing it equally throughout the world. So why all of a sudden is this a question now when it involves future generations? It feels like if it involves somehow, producing more now for our current group to consume as much as possible at the expense of anything else, then we'll just change what we're saying to make that seem reasonable, no matter what. So basically, the point of this is, okay, even if we are to grant that it's somehow reasonable, even though we're not distributing equally across space to do it across time, that has to do with marginal utility. There's already another variable in the equation most of these economists use for these called eta. It's not a time variable. It has nothing to do with time. It can't have anything to do with time. If people were earning less tomorrow, then we'd make it more unequal because time preferencing would still say we should have more today. So it doesn't have anything to do with the law of diminishing marginal utility or equality to put a time preference in there. It's the wrong discount. Put a time discount in there. It's the wrong discount. Okay. You know what? I am running short on time, so I'm just going to kind of actually explain these, and you're free to just pause the slide, pause the video, and read it if you want to get in more depth. So basically, this idea that it's crazy to think about other people. Okay, yeah, I agree. I'm not going to give up very much for anybody else outside of my personal sphere. So, in fact, I'm one of the greediest people I know. However, is not giving something to somebody else is not in the same category as stealing from them. We cannot care about other future generations at all. We can care about nobody but our own kids and ourselves, until they're 18 if we want. Okay, you make someone make me a bad person if I did that, but it's not in the same category as destroying the environment. With IAMs and environmental destruction functions, we're talking about destroying the earth, causing flooding, famine, species loss, forestation loss, destroying the earth that they have a right to be born into. Okay, we don't have to be concerned to do anything especially for them, but we do have a duty to not destroy the earth that they're going to be born into. So we don't have to have a concern for anyone but ourselves, and still it is completely rational to say, hey, we should leave this earth to our next generation the way we found it. Okay, that's conflating two different issues. Okay, this paradox of the indefinitely postponed splurge. I kind of like what I wrote about this, so I'm just going to let you read that, actually. Change my mind. It's actually pretty simple. When we're destroying the environment, there's not a paradox. We're not between efficiency and being able to enjoy what we've saved. There's nothing to do with that. We're talking about destroying the earth here. As time goes on, if we did nothing about it, the earth would just get more and more and more destroyed. We want to not destroy it. And the only value in destroying it is what we get back for it. And that is compensated with the integrated assessment models and the cost of carbon. There's absolutely no paradox in that. Koopman's paradox, as I call it, has nothing to do with IAMs, simply doesn't apply. So that can be rejected outright. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I personally feel that we should not call including a risk premium and environmental damage function on the possibility that the earth is destroyed for reasons having nothing to do with our destroying the environment, and not call it a time discount. This isn't a very big deal. Ooh, little mistake there. As if we do, that should say. And it shouldn't be boldface. So, same answer as to number 3. Okay, if the current generation left absolutely nothing to their kids, but we've earned and what we've worked to gain and what we've built, that might be cold hearted. It might not be cool, but, that's acceptable. We made it up from what our, parents gave us, so they should make up from, they should build themselves up from that same amount giving back to them, or we could even give them nothing, which that might, be something that's like bad, but that has nothing to do with destroying the earth. Okay, I mean, the fact that we only give 15% back to them does not mean that when government is calculating environmental damage functions, we should basically destroy 85% of what we had for them to inherit. Okay, this one is the one I hate the most because it's just like completely effed up. I mean, when I start reading this stuff, particularly by Nordhaus and someone called Robert Mendelsohn, um, they're just lying. Okay, I kind of said this at the beginning. The interest rate is determined theoretically by a time preference, but it does not happen. But an interest rate does not determine a time preference. The market does somehow not give us time preferences. Time preferences are a subjective choice. Number one. Number two, because people in the marketplace have a time preference for them and their generation, that has zero to do with how we discount other people, whether they're in this generation or in other generations. The two have absolutely nothing to do with each other. So it's just like an overtly kind of misleading statement. Um, in addition to that, the rate of return on capital, okay, is different than the rate of return on environmental damage. Environmental damage is determined largely by the climate laws that some of you study and probably will go on to study. The rate of return on capital is just for one thing, there isn't one rate of return on capital as they keep implying. I mean, if I start a shoe store and if I start an airline, I may get a different rate of return from them. There's not like one rate of return. The rate of return, it's not like magic or something. It's just how much you get back when you buy something to make something and, then usually sell it. I mean, you could not sell it. I mean, there's a rate of return if you grow a garden. The rate of return is you put, $20 into seeds. You put all the labor into growing it and maintaining it, and then, a few months later, I guess, you come up with maybe $50 worth of fruits and vegetables. So your rate of return is 150%. You put in $20, you get 150%. You get $50 back. So you have a rate of return of 150%. So I mean, it's kind of like that's the rate of return. The time preference is like that you need to get more back later because the time discount comes from time preference, which is that you prefer things now, and if you're going to wait, you want to get more, and in your garden, you do get more. So the time preference together with the rate of return is thought by some people to determine the interest rate, but the interest rate does not determine the rate. It does not determine a time discount, and the rate of return certainly does not determine what a time discount is. The rate of return and the time discount come together to determine the interest rate. So I will say, and it's more complicated than there's a very special case where if what you're investing in is really good for society, like not more junk food or cigarettes or useless sort of consumption goods, because you're time discounting things that are not environmental damage. If you are discounting environmental damage, society would theoretically tend to choose to not destroy the environment over producing something that may give you more back than you're not destroying. Okay, even though in theory that would be more efficient. That is true, but the problem is that the other things are being time discounted, and that's inefficient. Not that we're not time discounting environmental damage, because doing that is efficient. You're probably not going to understand that very much. My point is, there's a very special case where not having a time preference might crowd out some non-environmental investments, but that's not the fault of not time discounting that. It's the fault of time discounting the other stuff. And that fact has essentially been blown way out of proportion into making a lot of other, spurious claims. Like Mendelsohn says, well, the rate of return for the environment is much lower than the rate of return on capital investments or, societal investments like schools and hospitals and transportation. Well, that's just simply not the case. I mean, the rate of return on those investments might be 4 or 6%. Well, according to the Stern report, he was talking about the rate of return on green investments up to 1% of GDP is like from 500 to 2,000%. Okay, so there's a very high turn on green investments because the return is we're not destroying GDP. That's a very high return. Okay, so we may not get anything back from it, which we all know we do anyhow in nature and a lot of other things, but it's like preventing the loss of a whole lot more. So that's the same thing as a very high rate of positive return. So saying otherwise, an economist doesn't know that, I really think they're lying because they just really like urban industrial growth and really don't care about nature. Yeah, we've had our moments. Sorry for getting a little Ben Shapiro on some of you guys, but that's why you're an undergraduate. You got to learn how to reason, man. And yeah, I've learned a lot from a lot of you. It's been a powerful class, far more so than I could have imagined. So may the fourth be with you.